Because a good mentor isn't just helping you in that moment, they're preparing you for future adversity, future challenges. Like after you leave our care, are you prepared to continue to do things that are hard with resilience? And so they have to own the thinking. They have to be able to tell themselves the better story. And the more you care for someone who's suffering or vulnerable, the more tempted you are to tell them what to do.
Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity and discovery. My name is Cybele Raver, and I serve as the Provost of Vanderbilt University. As a leader in higher education and as a social scientist, I believe that we can transform higher education for the 21st century. At my core, I am wildly curious about other people's work, whether it's in science, the social sciences, the humanities, or the arts. This podcast gives us the opportunity to break open new ideas through discovery and creative expression. Welcome, David. It's really exciting to have you. You're a renowned social scientist and thinker. You are a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin and a co-founder of the Texas Behavioral Science and Policy Institute. You are best known, I think, for your work conducted with Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth and Greg Walton on these incredibly short but powerful interventions, these mindset interventions that influence adolescent behaviors, whether it's in motivation, engagement, healthy eating, dealing with issues of bullying, stress, mental health, and more. I think what's also really cool is that you leverage that intellectual powerhouse knowledge in the private sector, in the corporate sector, to really accelerate the way that those ideas are put into the world. You've partnered and consulted with Google, Microsoft, Disney, and the World Bank, as well as with the White House and the government leadership in California, Texas, and Norway. And apologies to Norway for pitching it in with states, but I just think it's really impressive to think about that.
Texans think of Texas as a peer with nations.
There you go.
So,
your work has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, CNN, Fox News, The Guardian, The Atlantic. I think one of the benefits of that span of types of outlets is to show how incredibly appealing and engaging these ideas are to so many different constituencies across the political spectrum. You have been ranked as the top 0.1%, that's 0.1%, of most influential scientists in the world in the past decade. And you've also been a middle school teacher and a basketball coach. And I love that you draw all of those strengths, including your training as a PhD and a master's student at Stanford, and your undergraduate degree and your master's in education from the University of Notre Dame, as well as your amazing role as a parent of 4 children. You draw all of those strengths for the work that you do. I really can't thank you enough for bringing that to all of us. Before we get into my talking about how much I love your work, I'd love you to read from the book, From 10 to 25, to give our audience a little snapshot of how great this framing is and how useful it might be for going forward.
it seems like everywhere you turn, you hear older adults, Gen Xers, millennials, and boomers, describing young people today in dark and despairing terms. In my 18 years as a developmental scientist and 13 years as a parent, I've heard it in the bleachers at my kids' games, in the boardrooms of major corporations I've consulted for, and by the water coolers at schools I visited. They just don't care. They speak a different language. They're entitled. They're too sensitive. But imagine a world in which older adults interact with young people, aged 10 to 25, in ways that reliably leave the next generation feeling inspired, enthusiastic, and ready to contribute, rather than disengaged, outraged, worried, or overwhelmed. In this world, managers' work will be easier because their younger employees will be motivated and self-sufficient. Parents will be happier because they won't have to dread their children turning into teenagers. Educators will feel more successful and less burned out because they can reach a stressed out or disengaged generation of young people. And all of us will be able to bridge the divide between the generations with confidence and without starting a war of words. I've seen this world in the lives of great managers, parents, educators, and coaches. I've studied what they do and how they talk. I've used the scientific method, hypothesis, experiment, data, results, to understand why they're effective. I wrote this book because I want to share the secrets of what I've learned. This book is for anyone who wants to experience this better world firsthand in their interactions with young people aged 10 to 25. It shows how to stop clashing with the next generation and start inspiring them.
I mean, there's so many ways that speaks to me personally, that speaks to me as a leader, that speaks to our values in this institution at Vanderbilt. And I'm so excited to dive into those strategies. But first, I just want to step back for a second, because one thing I love about your work is that you provide this incredibly compelling new way to think about the brain. And you give us this fresh take on the way that we think about adolescents' brain development. And I have to say, you kind of call out those of us who are guilty of talking about the way in which adolescents' brains might not be functioning the right way, right? So, the good old prefrontal cortex, executive function, the part of our brains that does decision making and remembering rules, which we really want kids to do, and using those rules to make good decisions and to wait before they, look before they leap, all of those things. We've had this problem where we've thought about that as less mature, which explains why adolescents and young adults can sometimes do things that we don't really want them to do. But in many ways, we've ended up telling a story of these sort of wild kids with these hyperactive amygdalas who are driven by their emotions, kind of this idea of, a driver behind a fast car with all that acceleration and no brake. And you totally reframe that by talking about this tiny, wonderful part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and how sensitive the nucleus accumbens is to testosterone and other pubertal hormones. So before we jump into mindsets, which I know is where we're going to go, help us understand why this part of the brain in young adulthood and even in 10-year-olds from 10 to 25 is so hyperactive or hypersensitive or so sort of alert to signals that matter to those young adults and those kids.
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed when I started looking into this literature how much the narrative has changed really in the last 15 years. I mean, and I have so much respect for your work. I was once asked if I could pick any colleague in any psychology department, who would it be? And the answer, I told my chair, you.
Thank you.
I have deep admiration for you and your work, so thank you for having me on your show.
Super kind.
I spent a lot of time talking to my neuroscience friends, Ron Dahl and Adriana Galvan, who, as you know, were a part of this movement to try to understand neuroscience and apply it originally in legal settings. So the dilemma about 25 years ago, was that young people, when they would commit extreme crimes, would be either sentenced to death or life without parole. And this disproportionately affected youth of color. So there's a whole social justice concern. And so the network of scholars said, let's take what we think we know about neuroscience and then let's give an argument for why that shouldn't be the case. Why shouldn't we lock up a 16-year-old for the rest of their lives? And the distillation of the science was that they can't help themselves. Their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed. They have no self-control. And so they're committing a heinous crime, but it's not really them, and they'll grow out of it. So therefore, there's no point in keeping them behind bars forever. That's a summary, but it's more or less the argument. And that had a substantial effect. So there were 3 different Supreme Court cases that then outlawed a lot of these extreme and irreversible sentences for youth criminal offenders. The issue is that same argument could be applied to lots of other decisions. Well, if they can't control their actions, then maybe teenagers shouldn't have the right to birth control. Maybe they shouldn't be able to decide who they date. If their brains are still developing till 25, maybe they shouldn't be voting. Maybe they shouldn't have a car. So there's kind of like this application of that logic that was kind of an issue. And so a lot of the scientists started saying, well, no, that's not really what we meant. And at around the same time, changes in technology allowed for different kinds of studies. So the original studies where you would just show activation in the prefrontal cortex, activation in the nucleus accumbens, and then it seemed as though the activation was greater among adolescents or those high in testosterone, et cetera, in the nucleus accumbens. And so there was this mismatch between the appetitive part of the brain and the self-control part. But later studies were able to look at connectivity and how those 2 regions were talking to each other, not just whether they were lighting up or not. And this started in animals and then into humans. And the connectivity studies revealed that the pathways went the exact opposite of what they thought. So the classic Greek idea, right, and you can read this in Plato and the Phaedrus, is that the rational, logical part of the brain makes kind of abstract plans and then tells the emotional part to cool it. And
top down.
Yeah,
right?
It's the top down.
The executive
control.
tells the worker.
The executive tells the frontline associate, right? And that is not really the direction in adolescence. It's really more that the appetitive desire part of the brain is telling the prefrontal cortex what it wants, and then the prefrontal cortex has to figure out how to get what it wants.
Right.
So what Adriana
I think
Galvan,
you give the example of an adolescent who figures out how to sneak out of a window to be able to meet up with friends, even though the parents have said they do not want that kid outside, right?
Yeah, so, like Adriana Galvan always says that the prefrontal cortex is for goal-directed behavior. Teenagers are very good at goal-directed behaviors. It's just not the goals that adults often want them to be pursuing. Adults want them to be factoring worksheets of trinomials and balancing stoichiometric equations, and teenagers want to look awesome in front of their friends.
Right.
And so it's not like they can't plan for a teenager who makes an elaborate plan to impress someone that they have a crush on, right? They might stay up all night practicing guitar for months and months. Right? That's a lot of self-control. That just basic insight suggests that this simple model of they lack a prefrontal cortex, therefore they cannot make wise decisions about their future, that is overly simplistic. Instead, it's what are they motivated by, and when do they marshal, when do they start using that valuable resource of the prefrontal cortex in order to achieve goals? And I didn't write about this in the book, but if you look at basic IQ tests like the Ravens, right? Human intelligence peaks between 18 and 23. That's the smartest we'll ever be, right, on fluid intelligence tests. But how many people in this room are like, I made the best decisions when I was in college?
Right.
Right?
Right.
So smartness is very different from judgment and decision making, and it's because judgment and decision making is in reference to a goal that we have and something we want to accomplish.
Right. And I think the beauty of that moment in the book is that you then pivot to help me, both as a leader and a parent, see that what's really motivating a student is social prestige, status, and a sense of respect, right, from me, the adult. So that when I put my kid in a high stakes situation, I think I'm navigating that in a thoughtful and regularly normative way. But from the younger brain's perspective, it's a test as to whether I respect that kid or whether I'm showing them enough recognition of their authority, right? So I'd just love you to talk about the nucleus accumbens in that regard in terms of this notion of status and hierarchy.
There's a certain kind of learning that is driven by pubertal maturation, specifically around achieving social goals. And in a lot of the animal studies, they find that if you stop the pubertal process, you don't get this kind of extreme social learning. There's there's studies of songbirds that I really like. So the most important thing to do as a teenager, if you're a songbird, like a cardinal or whatever, is to practice and perfect the song that will attract a mate. And so pubertal hormones cause this obsessive over-the-top practicing, like the teenager practicing guitar all night in order to impress somebody, right? And if you stop puberty, then they practice a little bit, but you don't get the obsessive kind of repetitive practice, and then they die alone, right? Wow. They never attract a mate, and then they're just
evolution failed,
yeah,
right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's a version of the story that's we often characterize testosterone as this male dominance or sex or aggression or violence or whatever, but testosterone goes up in both men and women, and along with other gonadal hormones like estradiol. And they sensitize the brain to social feelings like the thrill of getting admired or the pain of being humiliated. In all mammals, as puberty happens, you're hypersensitized to social information. And in humans, we have these more complex emotions like pride and shame, humiliation. That it's not just you're sensitive to them, you're sensitive to them because you're trying to learn how to be a socially successful person. And the rules for social success are subtle and they're negotiated, and you have to, there's no manual for being socially successful in your milieu. So you have to infer it from subtle clues that are not hyper clear. And that is the job of adolescents, is they need to be able to walk in a room and like, who is at risk of humiliating me? Like, who is at risk of elevating me? You know, where is social danger? Where is social support? They have to be able to do that instantly, right? But what that means is they're overactive in searching for meaning in very subtle social cues. And that meaning that they derive as they observe the social world may not be what the people in power were intending, right? So an adult might, like a teacher, might have a very rigorous and regimented, disciplined seating arrangement, and they're trying to separate the kids that are going to screw around or whatever. And the adult has the goal of helping everyone learn by avoiding the kids that are going to goof off, right? So in their mind, they're like, I'm helping you in your future because of this. But from the kid's perspective, it might be, this is like a totalitarian lunatic that is just yelling at everyone for no reason.
Right.
And how dare you tell me where I should sit socially, because now you're imposing your rules and values on what's a personal choice for me.
Such a great example.
You know?
I mean, who in this room hasn't been in that moment where you're like, I had no idea, right? That the thing I just did or said or asked is being interpreted in this way that is triggering a very strong sense of being on opposite sides rather than working together to achieve a shared goal, right?
Yeah. And what's frustrating for adults is we often do have the best interests of the young person in heart, but we're not hyper transparent about it. And so we leave important things unsaid, but because young people are used to that status difference of us looking down on, or this parenting coach I interview, she always says, yell, tell, blame, and shame. That's like a default mode for many adults that are concerned about order and discipline, et cetera. Kids will presume that that's what we're doing unless we're clear. And I talk about this study that I love, that my colleague Ron Dahl collaborated on. Jennifer Hill had an R01. She was studying maternal depression, so moms and daughters. And as a part of this bigger study, they bring the moms and daughters in the lab, and actually just bring the daughters. The moms pre-record themselves nagging the daughters, okay? So they're doing the yell, tell, blame, and shame. It's what I call grown-splaining, and I'm now going to mansplain grown-splaining to you.
Go for it.
And it's the idea that, like, you've pieced everything, all the good choices out in your mind with your smart adult brain, and then their dumb adolescent brain doesn't know anything. And we convince ourselves, if only I could like share the contents of my smart brain and transmit it to yours, then you would make wise decisions. And the fact that you don't listen to me means you're recalcitrant, you're rebellious, you're entitled, or whatever it is. And so they brought the kids in the lab, and the moms were grown-splaining and nagging on audio. And then the teenage daughters are there, and there's a big magnet whirring around their heads. And then they've got the earphones on. And the question is, what happens in the brain when you're listening to your mom nag you? Okay. So here's what happens 0% of the time. What never happened was the daughter was like, you know, Mom, you have a point.
Sounds like
I'm really glad for this long list of personal flaws that you've raised. I've got some homework to do. I'm going to make a plan, and I'll get back to you. So good chat. So that never happened. Once. Instead, what you see is this dramatic increase in regions of the brain associated with intense emotion. So the inference is that they're angry. A dramatic decrease in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, region associated with planning how to change your behavior. Probably the most interesting is a decrease in the temporoparietal junction. So this is the social cognition part of the brain. This is like, basically, are they inferring the good intentions that the mom was bringing with all of the words? Or are they attending to the literal part of the words and assuming that it's just negative and harsh and all these other things? And then you see a dramatic reduction in that. So the kids aren't sitting there saying, what does my mom really want when she's telling me that my room is a mess and it's no good and I'm lazy? Like they're not saying, oh, that means I should go proactively clean my room, right? That's an inference you'd have to make. The TPJ is shut off, they're not doing that. And what it suggests is that a lot of times adolescents are motivated for the status and respect. We communicate in ways that threaten it, and therefore we shut off we cause them disengage.
And I love that, right? That, often we inadvertently trigger an experience of threat when we meant to trigger an experience of collaboration, right? And so I'd love to pivot there and have you really then share the solution, right? This interesting, you were just describing what you call the enforcer sort of approach to top-down management, right? Or alternately, the protector is never, even venturing into the space of trying to shape or support your young person's, activities and experiences because you're so afraid or so stressed out by the likelihood that they won't meet those expectations, right? And then you have this really beautiful mentor approach that's, the sweet spot in the middle. So just give us a little bit of a color commentary on that to help us understand those three ways that we as older adults are approaching working with children and young adults that can really kind of provide more transparency and more support so that we don't activate all that threat.
Yeah, so I'll say the framework, and then I want to just share how I came to it in my process. So the framework is basically, a lot of people think you have two choices, that you're either tough, high standards, demanding, expecting a lot, negative side effect, you're an authoritarian sadist, right? But that's the price of doing business if you have high standards. Or you're nice, caring, friendly, supportive, negative side effect, you're a wimp or a pushover. And so it feels like you have two bad options.
Right. And you didn't prepare your child correctly for the world.
Yeah.
Right?
And
or
now
your
they're
student
feeble,
or your
lived in a cocoon their whole lives.
Soft bigotry of low expectation.
Exactly. Right. So there's that idea. And it feels like we just have two tough choices, right? And you can look in our popular culture and you see these prototypes, right? You see the kindergarten teacher that loves and cares for every kid, even though if they can't hold a pencil. And then you have like the high school principal roaming the hallways of the inner city school with a baseball bat, threatening everybody.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about movies that really reinforce that tough love image, right?
Those are our mental models that many people, if you're a teacher, you enter. I have to pick one of those. If you're a high school football coach, which one am I going to be? Certainly as a parent, the parenting coach I interview calls it the nice and nasty dance. That we're like, we yell and tell and blame, and then we feel guilty, and then we're overly permissive, and then the kids act out, and then we go back to the first one. And so what the first basic principle that I'd argue is that there's not one axis with two poles, it's like two orthogonal axes. One is standards, one is support. And you can have very high standards and very high support. And that's what I call the mentor mindset. And you can also have different errors. So one error is exceptionally high standards, but no support. And that's what I call the enforcer mindset. And that's the idea that, for instance, the society is unruly, kids are a danger to themselves, they're about to get out of hand, that, society's going to hell in a handbasket, chaos is around the corner. And therefore, I just have to enforce strict discipline and rules, and the way I can get kids to protect themselves from danger is extreme threats of punishment or maybe bribes. But I don't have a presumption that there's any internalized motivation that could be unlocked in a young person. It has to be external control. And what you end up seeing in an enforcer world is a few people maybe meet the standard, but they're the kind of people who already had so many resources that they were going to be fine no matter what. So they succeed despite the leader or the mentor, not because of the leader or mentor. And so you see massive inequalities in enforcer type classrooms or organizations. Protector is the opposite error. Very low standards, very high support. So that's, I'm loving, I'm caring. And that we learned comes from a belief that young people they've experienced toxic stress, they've maybe gone through trauma, they have all the ACEs, or they just went through COVID or anxiety epidemic, their brains are addicted to screens. It's just like we pathologize them and we conclude weakness. And because they're weak and feeble, it would be cruel for me to have high standards and expect something of them because they could never do it. And so I just resign myself to them knowing at least I care about them, right? They can put their head on their pillow and know I love them, even though I've expected nothing of them.
And I love that in the interviews that you have with students basically check out. They're like, since this is not going to yield anything other than, care, and since we don't even really believe this person believes in us, we're just going to take over the classroom and completely ignore the teacher, right?
Yeah. And the alternative to these is the mentor mindset, which is very high standards, very high support. And the way I try to characterize that was I tried to find people who, through whatever metrics, they didn't have this dilemma of communicating with young people that I've described so far. That for whatever reason, when they walk in a room, they command respect and they give respect, and young people feel taken seriously and so on. And so I found a lot of different exemplars. One was this guy who's Texas's best high school physics teacher. His name is Sergio Estrada.
Awesome.
And we did a statistical analysis. There's a network of educators in Texas called On-Ramps. So this is dual enrollment. So it's high school teachers teaching the real UT physics classes. Okay, so Mike Martyr, a famous physicist, developed freshman physics at UT Austin.
Yes, the real deal. Kayvon Stassen, real deal physics.
It'd be like 500 high school teachers across Tennessee teaching Kayvon's freshman physics class, right? And so, but what's nice is that their exams are graded by the UT professors in baseline in September and May. So we can calculate a value added score for every single teacher in the network. And then kids complete surveys. So we triangulate both value added. So do your kids learn more than you would expect based on their demographics, and classroom culture? Do kids feel respected? Are they motivated? Are they engaged? So you find those people. And we found 20 of them, and we brought them to Austin, and we had a workshop facilitated by this Stassen-like calculus professor named Uri Treisman, who's a legendary MacArthur-winning calculus professor. And so he had intuition about great teaching, so he helped us pull it out. At any rate, among those 20, the best was this guy named Sergio Estrada. It would be like if Buddha taught high school physics. Like everything he said was so wise and just calm and with this amazing, and just like the most profound insight into kids. And so after that, this is February of 2020, so right before the pandemic hit. And then for the first 2 years of the pandemic, Carol Dweck and I called him on Fridays during his off period. And I know you've spent a lot of time in low-income urban public schools. In a lot of these schools, kids are just wandering around all the time. And the reason why is because after 15 and a half, they don't even have to go to school because truancy court, they all know, takes 6 months. And so kids just stop going.
They're headed on their way out anyway.
And so the school's happy to even have them at the school. And so anyway, low-achieving kids in low-income high schools end up wandering into the only classroom where they feel safe, because most adults are yelling at them all the time or ignoring them. And so Sergio would have like 30 kids, parents from Mexico, kids,
everybody,
and all this stuff.
Not assigned to AP physics, just happening to be.
They would just wander in his classroom. Yeah. And sometimes I would be like, what does Mr. Estrada do? And they would tell me these unbelievable stories. And then I would start asking, who's the opposite of Mr. Estrada? And then I got some really good stories.
What are those strategies? Particularly, I loved the portion of the book that you addressed issues of how to deal with kids when they're under high stress. Because I think of myself as reasonably competent in being a good mentor parent rather than an enforcer parent or a, overly permissive, hyper compassionate but low standards parent or leader for that matter. Until things get really stressful. My daughter calls because she's afraid of a big, presentation at work, or we're about to have to meet really high external standards or demands. In that stressful situation, I resort to the telling rather than the asking.
Right.
So talk a little bit about this wonderful idea about really collaborative troubleshooting and this opportunity that we have to actually ask questions when things get scary. Yeah. I love that story of Scarlett and your daughter headed toward a really big performance. And, you ask a brilliant question in that moment rather than telling her how to manage her anxiety.
Yeah. I would just overhear Sergio working with students on physics. I was amazed. I basically never heard him explain a physics concept, ever. How is the best physics teacher not ever explaining physics? All he did was ask questions. He was like, I see what you have there. What would happen if you changed that? And then be like, and it'd be silence for a long time. And be like, oh, I get it now. Okay, thanks, Mr. Estrada. And he was just doing that the whole time. And he used this app called Remind. It's like a secure texting app for, keeps everybody safe, but you can still text your teacher. And so I saw the timestamps, and he was like one night on the couch watching Netflix with his wife or whatever, and a student said, I'm so lost, I'm so confused, I'm crying, I can't do this, I'm overwhelmed, yada, 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 right? And like Sergio, he teaches at Riverside High School, 2% of kids are college ready, but in his class, 95% pass college physics every year. He's a legend, right? But his whole life mission is like promoting equity and changing lives. So this is a moment where he's got a student that's about to, blow up. And I'm like, I would have been so tempted to be a protector in that moment and say, don't worry about it. We'll just do this problem tomorrow. Or who cares? It's just
pull the ripcord. Right? You're exhausted. Right?
Yeah. Or the enforcer would have been like, suck it up, right? Stop whining.
Things are hard.
Yeah.
They're going to be even harder in real life.
Keep going.
Right. Yeah.
And Sergio instead was like, all right, show me what you have. And then he's like, I noticed you already have this and this. What would happen if you changed that? And then he presses play on Bridgerton again and puts the phone down or whatever he's doing on the couch. And then 20 minutes go by, and then the phone lights up again. He picks it up, and it's like, oh, I see it now, Mr. Estrada. I can do it. I'm not crying. I feel confident. I'll see you tomorrow. And I was like, Sergio, how did you have the self-control to not be the protector in that moment? He's like, he looked at me like I had two heads. He was like, I would never deprive a student of the chance to know that they could understand physics.
So beautiful, right? I would never deprive person, whomever, from discovering that they're capable of figuring it out, right? I just love that.
Yeah.
But the level of self-control that it takes for us as the other side of the student mindset is that our mindsets have to change, right?
Yeah.
And I love the opportunity that you give to us through this idea of the do-over, right? That sometimes we don't get it exactly right, that we too have to have a growth mindset about ourselves, right? And I love when you're driving your daughter, Scarlett, instead of saying, this is how to handle the stressful performance that you're about to play, you say, what do you think I'm going to say?
Yeah. Scarlett got in the car. This is like 2 years ago. She's a freshman now. She's in 7th grade at the time. And she's like, it was April. So it was time for auditions for the next year's orchestra. And it was first chair. And don't ask me what first chair is. I don't
Sounds
know what it
really
means,
scary and important.
But according to her, it was a big deal. And she's like, Daddy, I'm so nervous. I have butterflies on my stomach. I don't think I can do it. And again, the enforcer is suck it up, stop whining, right? And the protector would be, I'll call the school and tell them you're sick. You don't have to go, right? A lot of parents do this. This is a very common thing. I hear this all the time. And, protect them from the stress and anxiety and failure. And I was writing a book, and I knew that if teenage girls do anything, it's find hypocrisy in their parents. And I was like, I can't write a book about what you're supposed to do and then not do it myself, because she'll throw it in my face for the rest of my life.
Yes, indeed.
And so I was like, all right, Scarlett, what do you think I'm going to say? And she was like, oh, well, you're going to say that the fact that I have butterflies on my stomach means I really care about doing a good job, but it's actually really hard because it's really important to be first chair. And so I'm nervous about it because it matters to me and it's truly courageous. And the fact that my heart's racing and my palms are sweaty is just getting cooler oxygenated blood to my brain and my muscles so I can perform at the level of my preparation. And I was like, Scarlett, how did you know that that's exactly what I was going to say? And she's like, oh, well, 2 years earlier. And then she reminded me that 2 years earlier, we were in a lake in Wisconsin, just north of Chicago, in Lake Geneva. And she was going to water ski for the first time. And I'm holding the skis behind her. And Uncle Luke has the boat. And Uncle Luke's about to say, hit it, and rev the engine. And she's super nervous about it. And she's like, Daddy, I'm nervous. I have butterflies on my stomach. And I was like, oh, Scarlett. And at that moment, I was like, I've been preparing
I'm a famous neuroscientist
for my entire life.
Yeah.
I'm not a neuroscientist, but we had just published a paper in Nature on this topic. And so I was like, yeah, this is great. I know one thing about parenting. I'm going to do it right now. And so I was like, well, Scarlett, the fact you're nervous means you're doing something kind of awesome, because you're about to be on top of water. It's unbelievable that the physics work, that you can just glide on
awesome,
water
right,
behind an enormous engine, and you're going to just be wind buzzing through your air. It's going to be amazing. But in order to do it, you have to be strong enough to hold on to the rope. And so your body knows that that's what's going to happen. And so you're getting oxygenated blood to your muscles to make you strong. And then when you pop up, then you're going to have so much fun and you're never going to forget it. And she was like, okay. And then she popped right up. She weighed like 70 pounds at the time. So all she had to do was go like this. And then she
see that.
She skied for like 20 minutes. And I just sat there bobbing in the water alone, kind of bored. But it was this moment where it could have gone either way. It's the psychologists, as you know, call it undifferentiated arousal. That there's a feeling of arousal. You don't know what to name it, right? This is the Schachter theory. But a mentor at a moment where they have that undifferentiated arousal and they could name it this or that, allowed Scarlett to name it something as my body preparing to do well, and then it actually became true. And then from then on, she didn't need me to tell her hypothetically what her body is doing. She had proof from her own experience.
Yeah, it's super exciting,
right? You're preparing
right?
them for future difficulty. And to be honest, when I interviewed Kayvon's former graduate students, they have these moments where it's like, I have my exam coming up to figure out if I'm going to stay in the PhD program, and they don't know what to name that. And a good mentor like Kayvon steps in and is like, this means you are doing something at the frontiers of your field. You're preparing to change physics. And we need you in your skills. And by the way, you're prepared. So use that as fuel to help you to do well.
It's amazing. And it's that combination that you describe of high transparency, right? You're not sugarcoating it. You're not pretending like it's no big deal. You're being really clear. This is a fulcrum. This is a key moment.
Right.
You are experiencing high arousal because it is super, super intense, right? And I have complete confidence in what's going to happen next, in the fact that you are ready, right? Or that you, right, even though it feels not great, you're going to figure it out. I have confidence in you figuring it out.
Right. And think about the implicit message of the protector move. Like, I didn't say, let's inner tube instead of water ski. You know, if that's what I would have done, then the lesson is, when it's hard, you should reduce your expectations and standards and remove the stressor. Right?
That's great.
And it would imply that I didn't believe that she could do it.
Yeah.
Right?
And that you leave room for that collaborative troubleshooting. Like, what do you think is a good solution in this moment, right?
Yeah.
That the question asking kind of breaks it open.
Well,
and gives more oxygen to that.
The thinking, because a good mentor isn't just helping you in that moment. They're preparing you for future adversity, future challenges. Like, after you leave our care, are you prepared to continue to do things that are hard with resilience?
Absolutely.
And so they have to own the thinking. They have to be able to tell themselves the better story. And what I read about in the book is that the more you care for someone who's suffering or vulnerable, the more tempted you are to tell them what to do. We want to transmit our expertise. It's like if somebody was lost on the street in your neighborhood, right, and they rolled down the window, they're like, where do I go? It would be weird to be like, I don't know, where do you think you should go?
How do you feel about that? Right?
Like it's the polite thing to do is to give them information when they're in need. And so we apply that same conversational heuristic when we're talking to our children in need. But the problem is that we haven't asked them to own the idea. So we have to overcome that compulsion to tell and instead engage in this routine I call collaborative troubleshooting, where it's your little curiosity, like, why is this error here? Like, that's interesting. Like, what do you think about it? And then, but still you're positioning yourself as a resource to continue to tinker and troubleshoot until you fix it.
I mean, so aligned with, my own interest in and excitement around curiosity, around the counterfactual, what would be true if what I'm thinking is not true, and another option might be open, right? It gives so much more oxygen and so much more room for that kind of creative problem solving, but also so exciting in terms of the values that I think we hold really strongly here at Vanderbilt in terms of supporting and framing students to be prepared for really high challenge, but also a really strong sense of purpose and a really strong sense of belonging. You have 2 whole chapters on that are just really exciting and inspiring. And I guess as we close, this is all great. And the examples that we've used are Sergio as a teacher in his classroom, or your experience or my experience working with, young adults in our own households or in leadership. But I think what's really incredibly powerful is to think about how you've now taken that as a nationwide intervention to dramatically shift how teachers teach in schools across this country.
Yeah.
So do you want to just close with a little bit of the sort of evidence that bears this out in terms of that randomized control trial?
Yeah, I mean, we're very hard-nosed about the research, and as you know, like I don't have a lot of patience for nonsense research, especially if it's going to be used.
Right, you say you hate parenting advice books, which I just love.
Yeah, just so many parenting books, so worthless. And I mean, they're earnest and they're wonderful people, I'm sure, but they're not. But like, I didn't want to write a book where it's like how to deal with your idiot teenager, because your teenager is going to see that book and you're like, what are you doing, mom? So it was important to me that the book operated as an actual intervention, or at least that I had confidence that the ideas in it, if truly adopted, would have a positive impact on the person who read it. And for me as a scientist, the only way I could know that is if I did a randomized trial. And so before I published the book, we took the content of mainly chapter 1, but also a little bit chapter 5 and 6, and we randomized hundreds of teachers across Texas to get that content and interact with it and answer questions in a double-blind design. And then we track the students' performance over time. This is with Chris Bryan and Cameron Hecht, my collaborators. And we found that students were more likely to pass the course at the end of the year, especially low-income students who might otherwise have experienced that enforcer or protector, and who might have doubted that they're taken seriously or respected. And we published that in PNAS last year. And then
that's, sorry for everyone else, that's the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Very, very big deal in our world. So congratulations, amazing.
So it's a great paper. We're very excited about it. But we actually tested the content of this. And then we said, well, let's do more than a one-time message. Let's actually support people over time to do the mentor mindset practices. And then in the book, there's this gray section that's all scripts that I wrote with educators and educator trainers. And so we basically took that kind of content and we created a model of what we call a fellowship.
I love this part.
And the idea is that conventional teacher professional development is like any teacher's worst day of the year. And it's also the parents' worst day because your kids are home from school for no reason.
It's right. In service.
Yeah.
For those of us who suffered through in service.
Like I had, this is not important for the story, but I had Ronan home, my 5-year-old, for his in-service, and I'm on a work call, and he runs in screaming at the top of his lungs because he has gotten a Lego stuck up his nose. And I'm like on a call, tweezers, Lego, because Margot's a nurse, so she was at work. And so like, that's one reason why in-services are not my favorite. This is like, I get Lego nose problems. But also teachers hate it because it's so didactic. It's a bunch of ivory tower experts telling you what to do. Okay, and when I was a middle school teacher, on most PD days, you look and you see the best teacher is grading papers in the back because they know it's a waste of time. All right, so I was like, how do we take good content or what we believe to be good content and actually have people adopt it? And what we found is that teachers are a lot like teenagers in the sense that they're constantly in this status disparity where society says you're in a low status profession, you're underpaid, parents are constantly yelling at you for ruining their kids' future, right? Every single school board election is run on how terrible the math scores are and how terrible so it's just constant blame and underpaying for teachers. So to come in and say, here's a long list of a million ways that you need to be more attentive to your students' feelings. And the way you're talking to them is screwing them up. Like that's not
going to be work, right?
So instead we said, hey, here's some science. It's new and interesting. A lot of people don't know it. They think this wrong thing about the adolescent brain. We're giving you the new stuff.
Some new, right.
But we don't know what it's like in your classroom. You are the expert on 6th to 9th grade math in public schools in Texas, not us. So what we want you to do is to take the science and then at the end of the year, present in a showcase how you applied the Sergio tactics. How did you do collaborative troubleshooting? How did you be transparent?
Awesome. You get social status among your teacher colleagues. They get
an invitation from their principal and superintendent naming them as a fellow. And we give them custom Yetis because I like to have as many Yetis personally as I can. And we give them a stipend. And so it's an honorific thing. It's not remedial. It's not like we're fixing your bad teaching. We're valuing you and your expertise and your professionalism. And then they work in a network, and monthly they meet with our virtual coaches. And I hired Sergio Estrada as one of the coaches.
Awesome.
And 2 other
Passing
people
it forward in this amazing way.
2 other people are just as good, and they're amazing, Charles and Christian. And so they meet with our amazing facilitators, and then they create their own mentor mindset practices and share them out, and they become a part of the legacy so future fellows come and see what you tried. And what we're finding is that students' math test scores in these classrooms are up by 0.4 standard deviations, which who knows if that's the effect size as it continues to scale.
Right, so that's how many months of instruction?
I mean, for high school, that's 2 years of learning.
So you accelerated kids' learning by 2 years by helping teachers to really, really not only adopt, but own and creatively move forward with that kind of a mindset change.
Right. That's if you believe the translation of standard deviation effect sizes.
But just for the purposes. Yeah.
That's absolutely how people would interpret it. But for me, as important as that is we survey the students and say how much they feel respected.
Awesome.
And that goes up, especially students of color. We found a 50% reduction in the black-white achievement gap for the math test. And then once the teachers have these engaged classrooms where students feel respected, their lives are better. It's like it's not pulling teeth trying to get kids to factor trinomials. They're willing
Everybody's
and eager.
Working. Yeah.
And so we see
machine.
Teacher burnout go down 50% and attrition go down 50%.
Amazing. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Remember to stay curious and keep exploring new ideas. We'll be back next time with another guest who's pushing the boundaries of discovery. Until then, I'm Cybele Raver, and this is Quantum Potential.
The Quantum Potential podcast comes from Vanderbilt University. Your host is Cybele Raver. Production by Matriarch Digital Media. For more information about Quantum Potential, go to vanderbilt.edu/quantum potential. Stay curious.